everyone could assist us with this and mute your line. And we're hopefully we've got a large number of attendees, but hopefully we'll be able to open up people's lines later to ask questions. Once again, I want to thank you all for coming. This is a particularly, I think, difficult day with everything that's been going on in our nation's capital. We discussed it and we talked about whether it would be appropriate to go on or not. And we thought that the most appropriate thing was to press on and to have this very important and timely conversation. So thank you for also thinking that this was something that would be valuable to do and for joining us. This is part of our Duke Sanford Cyber Policy lecture series and program. We have been running this for the past year and a half and doing regular events. And those of you who are interested, we can keep you in contact with us on future events that we're going to do. I want to specifically thank two of our co-sponsors today, particularly the Keenan Institute of Ethics for their generous support of our program and of this event, and the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security. I know we have Professor Dunlap and Professor Stansbury here in attendance. And I want to put a particular plug in for the conference that the Lens Center is doing on February 26th and 27th. This is, in my opinion, the absolute best academic conference that is done on national security law. Here in the United States, I can say that very well. I don't know if there are other countries that potentially do one that is equally as good. For those of you who are really interested in national security law, I really encourage you to visit the center's website and sign up for this year, the virtual event that's going to be done. And so with that, I would like to introduce our two speakers today. Sean Lyngaas first. Mr. Lyngaas is a senior reporter at CyberScoop and one of the leading cybersecurity journalists in the country. He was previously a freelance journalist in West Africa, where he covered everything from a presidential election in Ghana to military mutinies in the Ivory Coast for the New York Times. Mr. Lyngaas' reporting also has appeared in the Washington Post, The Economist, and the BBC, among other outlets. His investigation of cybersecurity issues in the nuclear sector, backed by a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, won plaudits from industrial security experts. He's previously a Pentagon correspondent for Federal Computer Week, and before that was a reporter covering the electric utility industry for Smart Grid Today. And most importantly, I don't want to miss saying that he is a graduate of Duke University, where he majored in public policy at Sanford. Sean, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, David. I really appreciate it. It's great to be here.
And we're also really honored to have Bob Sullivan here. Mr. Sullivan is a visiting scholar at Duke University and one of the leaders of the Sanford School's Technology Policy Lab, where he focuses on the intersection of technology and democracy. He was one of the founders of MSNBC, worked at NBC News for nearly 2 decades, and his reportings followed the most important technology issues of the internet era. Specifically, I recommend highly to all of you his various podcast series on the issues, Breach, So Bob, and No Place to Hide, which have extensively covered the current state of cybersecurity and privacy. So Bob, thank you so much for joining also.
Thank you, David. Great to be here.
All right, to kick us off, before we really get into the substantive discussion, which I do want to jump to pretty quickly, but we've got a number of students here at the event. And Sean, as a Duke grad, I was wondering, could you talk about how you got into cybersecurity and what lessons you think there are from that for the students particularly?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was kind of a circuitous route for me. Wasn't a linear A to B situation where one day I just decided to start writing about cybersecurity. As you said, I had the pleasure of going to Sanford for undergrad at Duke and was interested in public policy and international affairs, and ended up going to graduate school in international affairs at Tufts. And then I moved down to DC in, I guess it was 2012, and started looking for jobs in the think tank realm and thought I would be sort of a policy analyst something more traditional associated with my education. But in the meantime, I was pitching stories at night when I wasn't applying for jobs, because I've always been kind of a news junkie and a writer. So I started getting a lot of hits on some of the writing assignments, and eventually just decided to take the plunge into journalism, because my then girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, could tell that it was the thing that was motivating me and was really passionate about, was excited about my next article, my next investigation. And it also allowed me to combine some of the skills that I learned at Duke and elsewhere in terms of critical thinking and using data in investigations. And in terms of cybersecurity, that happened pretty quickly in the 2012, 2013 timeframe, where it started gaining traction. It started becoming an issue. I was working, as you said, for this trade journal focused on the security of the grid, and we started doing articles on cybersecurity challenges and vulnerabilities, and I could tell it was becoming a big issue. And wasn't necessarily my favorite issue at the time, but you have to kind of commit to a beat if you want to go places in terms of reporting, usually. So I just decided to stick with it, and here we are in 2020. There's been there's ongoing espionage campaign that we'll talk about, but many more exciting things that have happened in the last several years that I felt sort of made the decision worthwhile. And the journey, I would say, it's kind of can be an example or instructive for other people who think that, or are under the impression that you need a certain set of skills to go into cybersecurity. Yes, there are a lot of demand for information security skills, hard technical skills. That's important, but there's so many different careers in the broader sector of cybersecurity that don't necessarily require those skills. So that's what I found in reporting on it and writing about it. I'm not a computer scientist. I don't have a systems professional certificate in information systems. However, I talk to people who do, and they explain things to me. So I think there are a lot of opportunities out there in the field that don't necessarily require a hard cybersecurity background.
Well, what I love about that, there are many things I love about that, but Sean, I would say the understanding that you had a passion for cybersecurity and the impact that can be made from that, and then being able to follow that. I think that's a story I hear from a lot of people who are now the leaders in both privacy and cybersecurity public policy. It's not necessarily people who had always thought that they were going to do that, but they're people who develop a passion for it. I don't know, Bob, if that's was similar for you.
Now you can hear me. I just wanted to add one thing to what Sean said, which is, and David, how many meetings have I ever been in where it begins with someone saying, well, I'm actually not a technical person. In fact, lots of people who I think have technical jobs begin by saying, I'm not really a technical person, which just goes to show that you don't need to have a huge technical background to get into this field. I actually think if you get involved in cybersecurity at all, the sky is pretty much the limit, because there's cybersecurity in everything now. So if you like sports, you can get there through cybersecurity. If you like politics, you can get there through cybersecurity. So it's just a great route to get where you want to go, I think.
Agreed. Well, hey, I do want to dive into the substance quickly, because there's a lot here to talk about. And so what I'd like to do first off is to, if my Zoom skills align well, to actually allow us to watch a video. So give me 1 second.
As with the relief bill passed by Congress, there's another challenge which my administration will confront on a bipartisan basis: a massive cybersecurity breach against the U.S. companies, many of them, as well as federal agencies. And there's still so much we don't know, including the full scope of the breach or the extent of the damage it has caused. But we know this much: this attack constitutes a grave risk to our national security. It was carefully planned and carefully orchestrated. It was carried out by using sophisticated cyber tools. The attackers succeeded in catching the federal government off guard and unprepared. Foreign actors have been working this breach since late last year, at least last year, setting the landscape to compromise our systems, scraping up sensitive information from our world-class tech sector and from private businesses and from United States government agencies. The truth is this: the Trump administration failed to prioritize cybersecurity. It did that from eliminating or downgrading cyber coordinators in both the White House and at the State Department, to firing the director of Cyberspace and Infrastructure Security Agency, to President Trump's irrational downplaying of the seriousness of this attack. Enough's enough. In an age when so much of our lives are conducted online, cyber attacks must be treated as a serious threat by our leadership, the highest levels. We can't let this go unanswered. That means making clear and publicly who is responsible for the attack and taking meaningful steps to hold them in account.
All right, there was a lot there, and I think we can now start digging into it. Bob, I don't know if you want to kick us off.
I do. I want to ask Sean a question, but first, we can't run past this. What a big deal it is that the president-elect, at a time when he's got air for 2 or 3 messages, big, broad messages. He's not talking about healthcare. He's not talking about the environment. He's talking about cybersecurity right now. And that is an enormous change, even from 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 12 years ago. People who cared about cybersecurity and infrastructure would have dreamed to have a president-elect shove the word cybersecurity into a speech once. And here's Joe Biden making a big speech about it. So with that as the background, Sean, I'm a journalist, so I want you to lead with the breaking news. I know you have brand new news on SolarWinds, so I want you to tell us about that first. But as you tell us about that, just for anybody on the call who's not quite up to speed on all the details, can you also give us a quick summary of what this hack is all about and why it's important?
Sure. I'll start with the fresh news from today, I guess. The Justice Department publicly confirmed that it was one of the several federal agencies that was compromised in this apparent espionage campaign. They put out a statement detailing that somewhere around 3% of the email accounts that use Microsoft Office 365 at the Justice Department were accessed by the attackers, which signs point to the Russians. So what's 3% of what exactly? Well, I asked for clarification, and they didn't want to provide any more details. So not all Justice Department employees use Microsoft 365. However, I would bet that the 3% number is still a sizable number of officials who had their emails infiltrated. So that's the latest victim, and the Justice Department joins the Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, and others in terms of confirming breaches to their networks. Backing up a little bit to answer your question about the bigger picture, what happened. For more than a year now, I guess, this operation's been going on. It involves multiple vectors that the apparent hackers have exploited. And one of the main ones is SolarWinds, a company that many people hadn't heard of until a few weeks ago, but which nonetheless provides software to some of the biggest organizations in the world, oil and gas sector, many Fortune 500 companies, and of course, as we're learning, many federal agencies. So the hackers in this case were able to stealthily compromise one of the main software products that SolarWinds sells to customers. Is called the Orion platform, and they used kind of a classic espionage tradecraft in terms of infiltrating the update mechanism by which the company sends software updates. So the user is none the wiser. You trust the update from the company, and it's coming from a trust from a vendor you trust, and you allow that to happen. And over a series of several months, these malicious updates were sent to as many as 18,000 organizations. However, federal investigators think that the actual target of the espionage operation was much narrower. SolarWinds is the main, or one of the main vectors. Investigators are looking at other vectors. There was some news today about a possible software company called JetBrains, a strange name, but they're based in the Czech Republic, and there's been some reporting that they were also, the investigators are considering whether they were compromised. Now, I wasn't able to confirm that particular detail. In my mind, I didn't have enough information to confirm that, but let's just say that there could be more information coming out about potential software suppliers that have been compromised. So this is a huge scope. The hackers cast a wide scope in terms of giving them leeway to what systems they wanted access to, and then they decided to narrow down to more precisely the targets that they wanted. And U.S. agencies have said that it is likely Russian in origin. Of course, Moscow denies this, but they denied everything. They don't even admit that they conduct cyber operations, so we'll just leave that aside. And some reporting has suggested that the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency, known as the SVR, was the culprit. Again, that's to be confirmed, I think. But they have more of a reputation for being stealthy, kind of low and slow, not making a lot of noise on networks, so that they're harder to detect. If you compare that to the Russian hacking groups that were involved in the interference in well, to be clear, one of the groups that is implicated in this, has been suspected in this attack at SolarWinds, was also implicated in the 2016 election. However, the GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence Agency, was one of the other actors in the 2016 interference. And if you compare the GRU affiliated hacking groups with what we're talking about with SolarWinds, the SolarWinds campaign, the GRU, it tends to be quite a bit noisier and less subtle. Whereas the SVR, if it is indeed the SVR, has a reputation for long-running, stealthier campaigns. So you're up against a big, formidable adversary, and it's going to take months, if not longer, before the organizations investigating the breaches fully understand what happened. So that's what we're dealing with right now, all in the midst of a presidential transition and a pandemic.
And Sean, what was the Microsoft connection here? There is a Microsoft.
Yeah, there are other. This thing has a lot of different nesting doll, little layers of problems. So the attackers in this case, not only did they go after federal agencies, but they also went after some of America's biggest tech companies, including Microsoft, apparently, and a cybersecurity firm called FireEye. And with Microsoft, Microsoft has been leading in many ways, helping lead the investigation because they have the most visibility of any organization on the planet in terms of computer infrastructure, because they have over 1 billion people using their devices. And Microsoft has helped with the investigation, and they're learning more about it. And they said recently that the suspected, well, they didn't say Russian, but the attackers were able to view some of their source code, which is sort of the secret sauce that companies use to build software. They didn't modify it according to Microsoft, and it was detected, et cetera. But that's just a sort of a warning sign of how embedded these hackers have been in systems. So it implicates the private sector and the public sector in a way that a hack hasn't in a long time.
Hey, Bob, you've done reporting on some of the biggest cybersecurity breaches and attacks that we've seen, particularly your podcast series on the Yahoo and Equifax breaches. This feels different to me. I think it is different. I'm wondering if you think it's different and why you think it might be different.
I think it's similar in some ways and different in others. I guess just to race to the point, the big difference here is when Equifax was attacked, when Yahoo was attacked, the haul was data. The haul was an enormous treasure trove of hundreds of millions of Americans' personal information, or in the case of Yahoo, it was years, literally years worth of emails that they were able to download and read and use for all sorts of bargaining tactics or whatnot. There is this idea that a lot of security experts believe that one or probably more than one nation state or just large organized crime syndicate is building this incredible database of dossiers on US citizens, all of us, for use at some later date. Like maybe 20 years from now, one of you listening is a high-level government official and they can read an email that you wrote 15 years ago that might be compromising somehow. There's lots of ways to use this data. So those are sort of data hoarding hacks. This is a supply chain attack. And your brain starts to hurt when you think about 18,000 companies basically had a Trojan horse placed on their systems that allowed the bad guys, probably the Russians, to do whatever they wanted on these systems. When you think about how many people, how many employees that must have affected or could have potentially affected, the numbers seems almost infinite. And also, so this was that broad an attack. We've been told so far that the actual point of the attack was much more narrow, as Sean said. Yesterday, 4 government agencies, including the NSA and the CIA, said, as far as they believe, only 10 government agencies actually were infiltrated with a follow-on attack where something else occurred. But they were embedded in their system for a good 9 months and could do, we don't know yet what. But that supply chain nature of the attack, like attacking an intermediary in order to have this sort of access is quite different than what happened with Yahoo and with Equifax.
Yeah, and Sean, I'm just wondering how we should be thinking about an attack that seems to have been rather indiscriminate of whether it impacted the private sector or impacted government. Is that also something that makes this very different?
I mean, it certainly has happened before, but I think one point I would make is that it's, in 2020 and 2021 now, we're actually talking more out in the open about these types of things. I mean, computer spying by nation states has been going on for decades, but we talk about it more openly now. And you expect, as a reporter, you always expect transparency, but the public is beginning to expect some more transparency from government agencies on this, and there's going to be a lot of pressure to continue to give updates on the investigation. So I mean, it's not unprecedented in terms of spanning the private and public sector. It's just a bit eye-opening in terms of the access, just the brazenness of it, I guess, affecting some of the U.S.'s biggest companies. And when I first saw the news, the reason we found out about this when we did was that FireEye, the cybersecurity company that one of the most renowned cybersecurity companies on the planet, announced that they had been breached, and they're the ones that initially made that disclosure, and we might have gone on for a while longer not knowing about this had they not done that. And FireEye is known for attributing a lot of cyber activity to various hacking groups in Russia and in China. So when I first heard about this, that there was it looked like a smash and grab operation of FireEye's tools, proprietary tools that they use to test clients' defenses, I immediately thought, oh, maybe this is some sort of retaliation for implicating Russian groups. Now, turns out that's not really what appears to be the motive, but psychologically infiltrating, affecting companies like Microsoft and FireEye, American companies that in a certain sense are soft power, are examples of America's soft power. It has an interesting effect on how we respond, I think.
Well, and also what it seems interesting to me and also feels a bit different, it gets to the supply chain nature of this, that they used a cybersecurity company and tool to get the access, right? And so I don't know, Sean, maybe if we could talk a little bit more in depth of why that is particularly troubling to use this Orion tool and how that tool is actually used by all of these companies and agencies.
Absolutely, yeah. So the Orion tool is a network monitoring tool. Organizations use it to understand the health of their networks, to see data translating the network, and to diagnose any problems. It's a very popular tool. Like I said, installed at Fortune 500 companies all over the world. So the attackers picked a real sweet spot here, and that's the nature of supply chain attacks. We learn more about these companies that play such a crucial role in the software ecosystem that previously we hadn't. And with access to that Orion tool, I think it gives the attacker something that a typical software product doesn't. I mean, you can really burrow down into the network. The software is widely used in industrial organizations in the electric sector. I did some reporting on that. Given Russia's history of destructive attacks involving the electric sector, there was some initial concern, albeit not grounded in the details of the investigation, that, oh, well, if this is indeed Russia, well, what could they do with that access to U.S. Critical infrastructure? Now, again, there's no indication that this is anything other than espionage, but you start to get into some really concerning or very important considerations about what you allow that piece of software to do. I mean, this is a piece of software that can be used for access to, like I said, to industrial networks. It can be a bridge to further down into networks. So they picked from their perspective, the perfect target. And there are many other examples of software like this, of seemingly obscure companies that play such a crucial role that would be wise to shore up their security too before we're talking about another campaign like this.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that also. But to both of you, Sean and Bob, one of the things that feels really different to me about this is over the course of the past 15 years, when I talk with chief information security officers, one thing I've heard is that there's been this tremendous proliferation of cybersecurity tools they use to defend their organization's networks and the endpoint devices that the folks that operate within that organization are using. And by their nature, if you're using these cybersecurity tools, you do have to give them, I think we've argued many of these tools do provide fairly high levels of access. I think, Sean, you had mentioned earlier that it has come to light that SolarWinds wasn't necessarily in line with cybersecurity best practices in the way that they were defending their network and technology. And I'm wondering what we need to learn from that.
Right. I mean, this is a bruising experience for them, and they put out statements saying that they take cybersecurity seriously, and I don't want to pick on them necessarily. There's been some reporting in other outlets about they've done some cost cutting prior to the breach and weren't necessarily prioritizing cybersecurity. I haven't taken a close look at that yet in my own reporting, but I would just say we now, this is really bringing home how much we should value, we should impress upon companies, especially that do business with the federal government, to have a standard of cybersecurity. And look, the attack is sophisticated. I don't like using the word sophisticated and describing, it's way overused, but this one is. And so, I mean, some of the biggest companies in the world got breached that have, FireEye got breached, and they're the ones that usually investigate the breaches. So again, I don't want to pick on SolarWinds, but I think you've already seen lawmakers use this as a kind of a case study and examples. Like, this is why we need to have regulations and standards, baseline set of security standards. If you're going to do business as a federal contractor, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And I don't know if an audit would show that SolarWinds did that, or if they didn't, but it's definitely a teachable moment.
Bob, anything to add?
Yeah, there's the old movie where the criminal trying to break into the bank, bops the security guard over the head and puts on the security guard's uniform, right? And that gives them access to be able to walk around the bank with nobody being suspicious. We have more and more examples of that. I think most CISOs today would be really hard pressed to name all the various software tools they pay for to monitor network traffic, to optimize, to perform security tools. And that's a real problem, because what ultimately this is about is exploiting trust relationships. And the hackers here exploited the trust relationship that Orion provided them. I also think it's really important that cybersecurity is not SolarWinds' main business. So that was a software tool that had incredible access and incredible trust relationship with so many different points of the network. And again, it wasn't, their core business is not cybersecurity. So it's very, very hard to get a company to invest what's necessary to keep things secure unless it's either their core business or there's a regulation requiring them to do so. we've heard this over and over again. But the deli down the corner wouldn't have safe kitchen unless somebody made them. Having a safe kitchen doesn't make them money in sandwiches. That's, once again, this is as John just said, learning moment you really emphasize.
Yeah, I would just add real quickly, David, that there are still, well, as of a couple weeks ago when I did the article, there are still industrial organizations that are learning that discovering that they actually use this software, the Orion software. They didn't necessarily know before because it's baked into other products that they use. So that's why a lot of people call for this sort of thing called a software bill of materials, where you have a clear understanding of the code that's going into your system. And until you do that, you're liable to get breached like this.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that a little bit also. And this gets to with some of the comments and questions that I'm seeing in the chat. I think one of the things that's notable about this attack, first, is that it's really two attacks, right? It's the attack on SolarWinds to get access to their systems, to include code into their software updates that they're sending to their customers, which then is the second tier attack on those customers. And there's a couple things about that that I think are particularly interesting. So it has been reported, and Sean and Bob, I don't know if it's been in either of your reporting, so my apologies that I don't want to imply that it necessarily was, that number one, that SolarWinds did not have a chief information security officer, and that they were using a fairly simple, easy to guess password for access to their own internal systems that could then access the ability to be able to sign provide a digital signature to the software update that was then going to be deployed. And so I would say at least the first of those, not having a chief information security officer, is a pretty simple question for anybody to ask when they're doing vendor management to determine whether this entity that you are going to use a tool that's going to give fairly large access internally is somebody who is worthy to trust and to cause that your customers are going to have to trust. So I think it raises some particularly interesting issues around vendor management, because also I think this raises the issue when we're talking about an attack on the software supply chain, but it was the update functionality. I think a lot of people believe, oh, if you're using software, like you're gonna go review all the source code in that software and determine whether it's going to negatively impact your system or provide any kind of exceptional access. Those days, if they ever were really around, I think are long past. And so when we talk about what the public policy response should be, I think if we can't really depend upon source code review for everything, all these tools we're going to use, does that mean we really have to lean into vendor management? And what would that mean? Comments from either one of you?
That's the $1 million question. I think some of the most stealthy attacks on the supply chain in recent memory have involved, code signing, where as long, you look at the software that you're getting from the vendor and it's signed, if it's signed by, just pick an example, signed by Microsoft, you trust it. I mean, how could anyone tamper with that? Well, in theory, attackers can do that, and that's what happened here. So I think a lot of it has to go back to, you're not going to prevent all of these breaches, right? You're not going to prevent the Russians from conducting cyber espionage, right? That's going to happen. However, limiting the scope of the data, like, would we know about this a lot earlier had there been better practices in place? Yes, probably. And so I think the question, rather than any one solution of a new sort of software program or this or that, I think it's more having the resources in place at companies that do business with such a large footprint. And I think the irony about a lot of this is that the federal government cybersecurity work was laser focused for a reason on protecting the election. Now, it doesn't mean they weren't doing anything else during the last year. However, resources are limited and there's constraints. So this happened while all that important work was going on with the election, or prior to it, or prior to this election. So needs to be more resources and funding for agencies that do this work. I mean, there's a lot. I think a lot of people. I think there's some bipartisan support for increasing funding and personnel and support for CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS, because they need the resources to do this kind of work. They're trying right now. People were working over the holidays trying to figure out what was going on with SolarWinds and investigating that. So I think it's a combination of things: software, bill of materials, education, and having people requiring things of companies that do have such a big footprint. And then also reality, just realizing that you can't stop everything. And we shouldn't be, overreacting to breaches is also a big problem too. This is a big one, of course. People should be concerned in a way, but it's also espionage that we know, and it's also going to happen. So how do you limit the damage to it? I think one of the ways that the impact that Russian hacking operations have can have a bigger impact than they need to be when you overreact. It's a psychological element that happened in our response to the way that they're able to inject themselves in the 2016 election. Why did it have a big impact? I mean, okay, emails were leaked and everything. Were any votes changed? No, but psychologically and with the information ecosystem, the reaction that it caused allowed them to in a way achieve some of their goals. So the response to this particular breach is going to be really important, and we can talk a little bit more about how the incoming administration can respond to it.
Bob?
Yeah, I just want to add something that's near and dear to my heart. I'm always skeptical. My reporter's ears always perk up when automated tools are involved in any of these kinds of incidents. I'm old enough to remember a terrorist attack that was foiled in Seattle because someone, a border agent, spotted someone on a ferry who looked suspicious, and all the automated tools in the world didn't replace the gut feeling that border agent had. And people in security talk about this all the time. I got an email about a blog post when all this happened with SolarWinds. I just want to read a short bit of it. It's by a government IT worker who works locally, and he's complaining about all of these automated tools that are used for network management, which are obviously designed theoretically to be really good at what they do, but they also replace human beings, human intelligence, and all of that. And he pleads with people, rather than relying on the purchase of services and expertise, all these agencies should invest in staff so they maintain their ability to detect and respond to hacks in real time. Local trained staff will notice unusual occurrences or patterns on established platforms more thoroughly than a software-only solution would be. So I do think that this is a financial situation. Bruce Schneier had an interesting opinion column today where he argued that software is too cheap. That's a big part of the problem here. It's going to be much more expensive to make these things right and to hire the people to watch these networks. But I think we have tried to do this on a discount basis, and this keeps happening because of it.
But let's dig in a little bit there for a second. This also will address, we're getting some great questions in the chat, by the way, and so I'm going to start trying to integrate them in before we even just jump to questions. I've got a question from Jenny Arnold, and I think this goes to the software potentially being cheap. And it's really a question on the reporting and the current state right now. From what I've seen, I have yet to see a report that a national security system, a weapons system, or a classified system within the government has been breached. And so for those of you who have not taken Professor Stansbury, Professor Dunlap's, or my classes, you wouldn't necessarily know that within the US government, we have a special information assurance function at the NSA for evaluating technologies that will be used on national security systems. And there is a whole separate type of review that happens there, but we don't, or we have not in the past extended that out to the use for all non-classified systems, civilian agencies, or the critical infrastructure. I think some have argued that one of the reasons why we wouldn't do that is it's going to dramatically drive up costs, the ability and probably slow down innovation, that the use of commercial off-the-shelf software by government agencies and the critical infrastructure, that in the end, that is a net benefit. And so my question to you both is, do I still have my facts right, that it has not been shown to have breached those systems? If that's the case, does that mean actually we may have actually done something really right here? And I have no inside information, but I wonder, could we surmise that maybe our information assurance system actually is working to filter out vendors who may not be investing enough in cybersecurity? And then if that's the case, should we be extending that in some way? Sean, do you want to take a first stab at any and all of that?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, you have your facts right. There's no confirmed breaches of classified systems in this espionage campaign yet. There's no evidence of that. I haven't seen it. So again, it's the early days in the investigation, but so far that hasn't happened. Does it mean that we're doing a good job in information assurance? I don't know if I would say that yet. I mean, like I said, there's layers of access that they had access to, or they're trying to, in some cases, delve deeper into systems. So people talk about using defense in depth and that sort of thing in terms of if the attacker is able to access one part of the system, preventing them from going further. And maybe in some cases there were success stories of that happening, but I haven't seen them yet. So in the case of the Department of Justice that we talked about today, they had access to emails over a certain period of time, and that has happened at other agencies. So if there's success stories in network defense coming from this, I haven't seen them in that case. I mean, there are some positive stories. It's not all doom and gloom. I mean, there's people are writing new open source tools to be able to detect these attackers. It's sort of all hands on deck at some of the big cybersecurity companies to offer their services to victims and organizations. So there's some positive things coming from it. And your point about the NSA information assurance program, I mean, I haven't done a lot of reporting recently on that particular program or that particular initiative. But when I did several years ago, when I went to Fort Meade to interview Kurt Dukes, who was then the head of the Information Assurance Directorate at the NSA, and we talked about sort of the demand on resources of some of the agency's experts. I mean, they can't verify and certify every system going on. I mean, they have to focus first of all on the private sector, or I'm sorry, on the government networks that they are in charge of protecting them to a certain extent. Along with cybersecurity infrastructure security agency protecting, the NSA has more sort of jurisdiction over the DoD networks. So that's sort of like their charge number one. And then, I think sometimes they go out in the private sector and they do support some of that, but they can't be everywhere all the time. And again, that's sort of a few years ago when I did that interview, so it's a little bit dated, but I don't know if you can scale that. Now, the NSA is supporting some programs in security, the security of firmware. Firmware is, the embedded code on systems, and they are trying to, in some cases, Microsoft and the NSA are trying to make some of these stealthy attacks harder and trying to help the private sector with that. So there are initiatives out there, but in terms of scaling it, you need the big companies to invest in on their own. I think I don't think there's an NSA role to kind of writ large support companies in responding to this, because that would just never end.
Sean, I want to ask you a question. No one would ever admit a classified system has been breached, right, unless they had to. But in the very early days of the phone calls you were making about this, did you get even a sense of worry from anyone? Like, wow, I'm still feeling that this is deeper than we think. Did you get any sense that maybe something like that had occurred?
Right. Yeah. So the scope of what we know now is not again, this is so evolving, and yes, early phone calls to sources in the aftermath of the revelations kind of told me that people are concerned about where this may lead and what, the goal if the goal of the operation is espionage and government secrets is the target, then of course naturally you turn to say, okay, did they get into any classified systems? And this might be a good segue to talk about previous alleged Russian operations that have really shaken up the way the U.S. government tries to protect its networks. I think of two big, they're actually a decade apart, and ironically, there was the late 90s and then the late aughts, and now we're a little bit past the late next decade. So it's almost like 10 years apart where there have been seismic suspected Russian I keep having to couch the language because again, I don't have a security clearance, but suspected Russian operations that have really caused U.S. officials to reevaluate how they protect the networks. In the late 90s, it was something called Moonlight Maze, where a espionage operation seeming to come from Russia targeted military research labs and other. This is relatively early days of the internet, relatively speaking, and it was sophisticated, and that caused a stir in terms of how the government tries to protect their networks. And then the next example came 2008, 2009, in potentially Russian operatives able to actually, in this case, get into classified systems in the Department of Defense using, suspectedly using sort of a malware on a thumb drive. And the response to that was what led to the creation in part of the U.S. Cyber Command that we know today that was involved in protecting the 2020 election. So how the government responds to this latest seismic breach, again, I think it's again going to change the way that we think about computer network defense.
Thanks, Sean. So one of the things that we've mentioned a couple of times is the nature of what we think the motive of the attack have been. And I think this has been a bit all over the map in what I've been reading about this. And so people seem to be indicating, oh, we think this was just espionage. And, and so you get the message like we saw from President-elect Biden of how serious this is and demands a response. You hear other people say, oh, we do this too. There's no, global norm against espionage. And it's not clear to me that we're actually prepared yet to actually say that this is only espionage. And I wonder, Sean, if you could start off by commenting on that. And where are we with really understand? I think we maybe a little bit more detail about how certain should we really be that this was Russia, and how certain should we be that this was really espionage and not something different?
Right. So I've had no indication from sources or anyone else that this is anyone other than Russia. Now, I don't have any definitive proof that it was. The President Trump basically suggested that it might be China. I have not seen any information to suggest it's China. But you're right to be cautious about attribution because you have to be privy to that information. And then we haven't been given a lot of technical details from the U.S. government investigators to corroborate Russian involvement yet. However, in their most detailed statement to date on the investigation yesterday, they said it's likely Russian in origin. And you raise a great point about espionage, and of course, U.S. government spies do this, in different circumstances, in terms of cyber espionage. And this was not a sort of norm-shattering event like the NotPetya attack, where you had, ports disrupted because of a malicious cyber attack that was attributed to Russia, and then electrical outages in Ukraine as a result of cyber activity, again attributed to Russia. So this is not one of those norm-shattering instances. However, I think what some people would argue is that what the line that this may have crossed. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this, but that because of the sweeping nature of the supply chain compromise, many private sector companies have been swept up in this, or left to wonder if they have, and that kind of messes with a private sector ecosystem that has nothing to do with spying, or you have companies that are re-examining the integrity of their products and questioning them because of this. That's the kind of a point that the Microsoft president Brad Smith made. This is a bit different because of that. Now, that's a great debating point. So I think regardless of this situation, there has to be some progress in terms of building norms. To date, the U.S. efforts to get especially Russia to sign on to some sort of cyber norms have been halting, I guess is a nice way to put it.
Yeah, that's a collateral damage you're talking about there, which is a kind of a sort of scary territory to go into. Brad Smith also talked a lot about digital mercenaries in his blog post.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that there are companies that are selling offensive hacking software now just to the highest bidder. And, you know, the US buys software from such companies, but now obviously our adversaries can buy it as well. And that's getting messy.
Absolutely.
I'd like to now open up to more questions from the audience. And I'd encourage anybody who'd like to ask their question by audio, just put your hand up in the tool, and I think we should be able to unmute you. And prior to that, I'll read some of the questions that I received ahead of time or that were in the chat. There's a really interesting one from Anne Lelena in the chat. Which related to something I'm also continuing to be interested in as a probe on the last discussion we had. Anne's question was, please discuss the probability of the infected agencies and firms actually being able to identify and remove all remnants. And she also is thanking us for doing this, and you're welcome, Anne. The way that that's related is we may only have been able to right now believe that this was for the purposes of doing espionage. But it looks like this was, number one, it's not clear to me that we fully know all of the ways that it may have changed systems or code may have been inserted. And number two, isn't it right that this potentially created a pathway in to be able to do other things, whether that would be to change data or to bring down networks or to do other things that we would say cross the line beyond espionage. And so is there, number one, a point in time where we would say we're comfortable, like, oh, we're just going to treat this as espionage, even though people are leaving in potentially exceptional access mechanisms that they could use for anything? Are we comfortable just saying that's espionage and that's within international law and international norms? And then second, once we see that this has happened, what is our likelihood of being able to get all the remnants out so that we cut off that access?
I could take a stab at that, I guess, first. I mean, it's going to be a long time, again, before people understand the full nature of this. And I mean, in some cases, I think, I mean, I'm not responding to these incidents myself, so I'm not on the ground, but I think in some cases the level of sort of corruption of some of these systems, they might need in some cases just to rebuild another network just so you trust that network, to allow your organization to trust that network. I mean, at what point are people using their US government emails going to trust that the attackers are out of there? If you go back to 2015, I believe it was 2014, 2015, when the SVR was, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency, was implicated in some compromises of White House unclassified systems and the State Department. Again, the SVR is the same group that has reportedly been behind these SolarWinds compromises, but we don't know that for sure. But anyway, the point being that this particular entity can be really difficult to evict from computer networks, and knowing that, you need highly trained specialists like people at the NSA or some of the top cybersecurity companies who are able to determine that your network's clean, and maybe they're not going to come back in through that back door that they installed previously. And then, so to the question of the likelihood that they'll be able to determine that, I mean, that's really difficult to say. Some agencies are much more adept at that than others, and they're going to need help. But again, right now we're in the middle of a transition, and resources are stretched. So it's going to take, many multiple agencies and multiple organizations collaborating to actually get the job done. It's going to take months, or if not longer.
And since all these things are interconnected, even if one part of an agency is able to clean its network, you can't necessarily believe everybody else did, and things can get reinfected. It's very difficult. I would like to say, there's still so much we don't know about this hack, but in the Equifax hack, for example, the criminals got access in March. They didn't do anything until July. That's actually pretty typical, because the groups of criminals are out there trying to hack systems all the time, and they get access, and they later find some reason to use them. As far as this whole, were they laying in wait for some future purpose, or maybe they did something terrible that we just don't know about yet, that we won't know. But generally, the things that would be really terrible, like say shutting down a power plant, that would announce the hack. So, you know, lying in wait quietly seems to have been the motivation here, and, you know, perhaps quietly extracting data. But the possibility you always have to account for is whoever did this was amazing at covering their tracks. And if they were amazing at covering their tracks, they really could have done anything. You know, Microsoft says these hackers viewed Microsoft source code, but didn't change any source code because that's a whole different thing. And by the way, it's no big deal because somebody seeing our source code doesn't actually expose anyone to additional risk. And you know, do we believe Microsoft, and does Microsoft know all that within 3 weeks of investigating the attack? I don't know.
Okay, I want to move to another question. Linda Noel asks something, how should the Biden administration respond to the SolarWinds attack? And I'm interested in people's thoughts. What recommendations do you have for the Biden administration?
Bob, do you want to go first on that one?
Oh yeah, sure. I'll go first on that. I mean, I think, like so many things, this is an issue of focus. I'm so glad you brought up what you brought up about the election. Chris Krebs got all sorts of high marks, rightly so, for how he handled disinformation issues around the election and all that. And not to blame him or CISA for what happened here, but it's easy to imagine that a lot of focus going in that direction, and we weren't just focused on an issue like this. And so I think the biggest challenge for President-elect Biden is going to be, how do you make some kind of a statement that serves as a warning and as a deterrent? The U.S. is in no position to escalate a digital cyber war with anyone. We have the most to lose in an asset like this, in an engagement like this. And so figuring out how to create some kind of pain point to discourage this kind of activity in the future, that's the biggest challenge. But again, you know, I hope that speech that we heard earlier in this Zoom call isn't the last time we hear about this until 10 months from now when there's another attack. It has to be an issue of focus.
Right.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, Sean.
No, I was just going to say briefly that, I mean, it's been seared into their minds how they're going to respond. I mean, they're, like I said, they're trying to find out as much information as they can right now while they're trying to take the reins of government. So it's like with them from day one that you know, the cage has been rattled, and some of the U.S. government networks are proven really vulnerable. I would just say that, you know, editorializing a bit, I would maybe shift the balance a little bit in terms of spending, government spending on defense versus offense in cyberspace. You know, we don't see the black budgets anymore in terms of the intelligence agencies, what they, I mean, other than the Snowden documents, we don't really know what they spend on cyber operations, but there's a lot been invested in offensive capabilities in the last several years, and it makes sense, I think, to invest more in defense. Again, you want to be realistic about what you can prevent, but making it less easy for something like this to happen, but also having a clear line of communication with Capitol Hill about what the resources that you need and that you want, and having some consistency there. One of the bright spots in terms of, you know, you talked about it earlier, Bob, in terms of cybersecurity, is we used to think about it as a bipartisan issue. It still can be a little bit. I mean, despite all the craziness that's happening right now in the country and government, there can be some bipartisan agreement on cybersecurity, on protecting U.S. assets and secrets from theft. So I would suggest pressing home that point and interacting and going hat in hand to the Hill for more money on it, on cybersecurity.
Well, this is, I think, a really good lead into a question that one of our students wants to ask, actually. Chaz, can you possibly unmute to ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me all right?
Sounds great.
Great. So yeah, I also put the question in the chat if that helps, but I just remember reading on first or second day that the password that they had securing the system was SolarWinds 123, and that's the same password my friend's company uses, which is really embarrassing, and we always make fun of him, but they still haven't changed it. So I'm just curious, at what point are we going to see actual consequences? Maybe not to SolarWinds for this attack, but whether you think they'd be commercial or criminal, things passed by Congress. I'm just curious what it would take, and what the chances are, and what those consequences you think would look like.
So I'm glad you asked that question. I'm pulling up as we speak an article that my colleague wrote about potential legal consequences for this. I mean, I think it's again, like with a lot of this, it's TBD. But I think, let me see what he actually ended up reporting. I mean, one potential area of liability is whether SolarWinds or its customers were negligent in maintaining security practices. I think he actually mentions exactly what you just mentioned with the password SolarWinds 123. So I think there'll be some appetite for those kinds of lawsuits, but whether they actually land any punches, I mean, on the other hand, we've seen the legal landscape shift a lot in the last 5-10 years, where Home Depot is still paying out breach settlements for a breach that took place 6 years ago. So people feel that their data has, they have an inherent right to have their data protected, and they're increasingly willing to go to court to prove that. Actually, David might be a better person to answer this question since he has a legal background, but
I think it's been really difficult. Congress has taken a couple of attempts to try to do something here. We landed 10 years ago on an approach of saying a highly regulatory approach and an approach focused on liability in an environment where we know that no matter how good your efforts are, there's still a possibility of being breached, is a very difficult one to navigate and to set the right standard for. We largely landed on a self-regulatory approach using standards in the cybersecurity framework that NIST has arrived to. I think these are really important questions to say now. Do we need more when there's some very basic best practices that aren't being followed? Bob, I'm really interested in how you would think about that, particularly because part of Chaz's question in the chat was about, hey, Equifax had a momentary consequence and then they came roaring right back. And this question about, I think ideally you'd love, particularly for where there's situations where there's been amazing reporting, like what you and Sean have done, that people would say, oh, well, that's obviously not a company that I want to do business with, and that there would be some sort of consequence to being shown not to take adequate care. Not clear from watching or listening to your podcast that that's happened with some of the other really big breaches.
I mean, I really can't think of one where it has happened. Just in defense of SolarWinds for one moment, which is unlike me, I've done a little reporting on the SolarWinds 123 password thing, and it is unclear to me that it's been characterized in some press as that was the password for their software update server, and that's all it took to commit this infiltration. That seems to be a gross over-exaggeration. So I don't know, because that sounds flat out negligent, right? However, having lived with Equifax for about 6 months, I can tell you Equifax was a comedy of errors, which was full of flat out negligence. And other than a very temporary hit to their stock market, their stock price, Equifax is just fine, thank you very much, despite paying out money. There is already a class action lawsuit, a lawsuit seeking class action status, David, against SolarWinds, and it mentions the password issue, for example. There does not seem to me to be any meaningful way right now to penalize companies that engage in negligent behavior in the construction of software. One suggestion I've read in the last couple of weeks that I really rather like is from Alex Stamos, who was the chief security officer at Yahoo when that happened. and he's at Stanford now. And he proposes having something like an NTSB for big computer hacks, so that when there is an incident like this, there's a team, the way that a federal team swarms around a plane crash site to figure out what happened. They look at the black box, they come up with a report that's public, so everybody can learn from it. That we create a government entity like that can investigate these big hacks, and it would be both educational, and it would also produce documents that would help people, you know, get back whatever it is that they deserve when they've been victimized as a part of an attack. But one more thing, I spent about an hour on the phone today with someone who's pretty high up at a banking regulator in DC, who begged me, I told him I was going to be on this call, and he begged me to stop shaming what he called as the victims. He spent the last 2 weeks pulling his hair out trying to figure out what happened and try to fix things for his systems. And he's in charge of regulating banks who are talking to him as well. And it is a fine line to figure out who the real perp is in a situation like this. The perp is the hacker, is the company that's hacked. You know, to what degree do they deserve to be blamed for being hacked? I think I have been as guilty as anybody else at poking fun at companies when they are actually victims. And so, like, putting the placing blame correctly in these situations, I think is a real challenge.
I agree 100% with that, which is why we have tried to destigmatize being breached. I mean, the headlines are never going to be flattering, and but you don't want to just keep kicking people while they're down, and then that. I mean, you want to sort of strike a balance between good hard-hitting reporting and exposing things, but not gratuitously just piling on. So everyone gets breached. Was SolarWinds negligent? I guess that's up to a sort of deep dive investigation to decide. But something about the ecosystem has to change too. It's much broader.
Yeah, one of the things that I've seen other people recommend, I'm not the first person who's commented on this, that could change in the ecosystem is getting back to the vendor management question. I think we did make a bet 10 to 15 years ago, particularly in the Obama administration with NIST and with the folks that, the work that Michael Daniel and Ari Schwartz did within the administration to promote the NIST cybersecurity framework and a robust risk management process approach to cybersecurity. And I think most people that you talk to say, look, investing in resources to make sure you're asking the right questions and doing a risk management exercise is one of the best places you can devote resources to be able to spot these issues. You might be able to spot the fact that you're not effectively managing passwords, or that you're not effectively deploying the right people in the right way for that. And so one way we could do that is use the federal procurement process even more robustly to say, look, nobody's getting federal contracts unless that not only have you demonstrated that you followed the NIST cybersecurity framework, but for certain kinds of contracts, depending on what systems the tools are going to get access to, maybe you should have to have some sort of third-party audit, actually, that you are following the NIST cybersecurity framework. And if we're going to do that for government systems, and if we're going to build that into federal contracts, that's an interesting question, at least for the critical infrastructure to ask themselves, to say, should we have a template agreement that incorporates those types of terms into our agreements also? And then should we actually deploy resources to investigate and audit and make sure that people are actually in compliance with those terms? It does not strike me that it's impossible to ask the question of vendors, what are your processes and people and policies that you've put in place to comply with the cybersecurity framework? Sean and Bob, what do you think about that recommendation?
Sean?
I think there's a lot of recommendations floating around right now, and like you alluded to, it's the how do you enforce them and how do you get people to comply? I think in the new Congress, there's going to be more of an appetite for binding laws to that effect, but it'll be difficult too, because there's always been resistance to sort of holding companies' feet to the fire in this regard, but maybe this will change it. I think in any recommendation like the one you just laid out, it's a question of enforcement and following up and making sure people are complying.
I've heard more than once that compliance is the enemy of security, because when you're trying to satisfy a compliance rule, you're not actually focused on security, you're satisfying a compliance rule, so it's very, very hard to make compliance rules that are in line with this goal. But I also, I repeat myself sometimes, but I feel so passionately about this. There really does have to ultimately be an economic incentive to do this stuff well. I mean, that's just the way our system works. And right now, almost all the incentives are the opposite. All the incentives are to innovate, to do things quicker, faster, to get rid of people. And we have to come up with some kind of creative innovation that makes it valuable to a company to be secure, just like it makes it valuable for a restaurant to have to pass a health inspection. And we're still lagging behind in that whole concept.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want to bring up a comment that one of our former students who is an alum and practicing in the area of privacy and cybersecurity now, which is exciting to share. It's exciting to see you here in the call, raised about the California Consumer Privacy Act and the breach notification requirement and the liability that can affix to the private right of action in that particular law. And be interested, Sean and Bob, in your thoughts on, do you believe that we now have breach notification laws at the federal level for health records and also in every single state. Now you've got this private right of action in California affixed to breaches. Do you think breach notification laws have made a big difference? Do you think that's working? And do you think then California's approach in a limited way to putting some level of liability associated with breaches is an effective way to encourage more investment?
I think it does. I'm not an expert, but I'm also biased in the sense that I love the California's privacy law because I can, every day I can go to the Attorney General's website and search to see which new companies have revealed breaches that they might not otherwise report, and then I have a potential news article. But I do think it ups the ante and again creates more transparency and disclosure requirements to the extent that they can destigmatize breaches, and also what's going on with GDPR in Europe too has been it's been a real pain for a lot of companies, but you have to respond to it, and it forces you to improve your security practice in a certain sense. But I'd be interested in hearing what Bob has to say on that too.
So a breach notification, California's rule made my career basically, so I owe it a lot. I've been writing off the website of the Attorney General's website since I started, and I've written so many stories on this ilk that I've come almost full circle. The average consumer now, I mean, how many times over have we all gotten a year's free credit monitoring because our data has been lost? I think I'm covered until I'm like 160 from all of the free credit monitoring I've received from Leak. And so it's now the signal and noise ratio is off the chart. That was a great tool of its time. I think it's not very useful to consumers anymore, and now it's just sort of a public logging thing. I'm not quite sure how efficient it is. I have, because of the consumer stuff I've written about for years, I'm a big fan of private right of action, just because there's that rarely used, but the one or two rabble rousers out there can really cause a company to change it. It really puts power into individual human beings who can ask questions, and it acts as a leverage point. I will say, however, these are incredibly brutal tools for what we really, really want to accomplish, which is safety and security. And like in my vision, we kind of get past the stage into something that's not quite as blunt.
Right, absolutely. And we're not going to sue our way into better security, so it's sort of a backstop rather than an ideal tool.
One of the things I'll be really interested, I do think we're going to see continued attention in Congress for the next year or two to federal privacy legislation, which potentially a private right of action and the degree to which that legislation would preempt the states, I think most people say are the two most pressing issues there. There's some really good work that's being done to tease out the nuance on both of those issues. So it's not just complete class action private right of action, and it's not complete federal preemption, but different slices of it. Cam Carey with Brookings, former general counsel at the Department of Commerce, has done, in my opinion, the best work on this. I think we're going to have some real opportunity to get down and start talking about some nuance on these issues and the way to create proper economic incentives, but also where hopefully we can create some compromise and consensus so that we could pass some legislation. It may not be a targeted specific cybersecurity bill, but it might be a privacy bill that has cybersecurity components. I think we'll be able to do multiple more of these events talking about those issues. I want to go to another question. I'm going to ask Mark if we can unmute, Mark Lucido, if Mark could ask his really interesting question that he talked about legal authority for retribution.
Thanks, Professor Hoffman, and thanks, gentlemen, for giving us your time tonight. My question is based out of the TrickBot takedown, where, from what I understand, the cybercom efforts and the Microsoft and the financial securities ISAC efforts, although they were successful in taking down TrickBot, they were somewhat uncoordinated or fractured. So I was wondering, what authorities or precedent is there for the FBI and cybercom to conduct combined offensive operations, but also sensibly or in some sort of standardized way incorporate private industry, the ISACs, and legal mechanisms to enable allied law enforcement agencies to conduct those takedowns as a matter of practice and not just a matter of circumstance?
That's a great question. I love it. I saw that, and I was hoping we would be able to address that. I'll start with what I know in terms of how it's gone in the past, just with like FBI and cybercom, not necessarily the private sector side of things. When the U.S. Cyber Command was responding to, sort of conducting its operations against ISIS a few years ago, the Islamic State, so-called Islamic State, and there's been a lot written about how, previously the legal frameworks for some of the stuff aren't necessarily well hashed out until you actually do them. There's a lot of lawyers involved in the back rooms of these intelligence agencies, saying yay or nay to things. At least they have been in the past. So with, I think it's called Operation Glowing Symphony, the U.S. Cyber Command's operation against ISIS, there was more coordination previously than there ever had been, I think, between law enforcement, cybercom, and other things. And now, fast forward several years later, the FBI recently put out a new strategy that explicitly, or at least in the interviews they did with the press with people like me, explicitly states that they are going to be more aggressive in working with Cyber Command to feed them intelligence so they can conduct operations, and maybe vice versa. So that's the government side of things working together a little bit better. When you start in the TrickBot is a great example. You need to involve the private sector. So going forward, how do you make sure that coordination is there? I think it starts with the fact that some of these companies like Microsoft and FireEye have been working much more closely with the government on protecting elections and other things. And so there's a bit more of momentum to actually have people on the same page for important disruptive activities like the TrickBot one. So I don't really have a specific answer to your question about the legal frameworks, because I don't know necessarily what that would entail at this point, but it certainly, I think, needs to happen to be more successful in the future.
I just want to add that I'm fascinated by this idea that private companies can go to other private companies and with, whatever the legal term is, exigent circumstances, change or alter private property. And almost all the examples we have right now where the crime is so egregious that no one seemed to mind. But every time I see it, something inside me wonders, when are we going to have a controversial situation? And I wouldn't be surprised if we're coming up on that even with today's activity pretty soon.
Right. I think just one more point on this. I think there's less reluctance these days for private sector companies to actually work with the FBI in this. After the Snowden disclosures, there was all kinds of blowback and chilling effect of that kind of thing. But now with, I think it comes back to election security, people seeing sort of this big potential threat to interference in our democracy and saying, well, whatever, we'll just get it done and let's protect it. And we'll figure it out legally. And we're all on the same side here. And so I think that kind of momentum can carry over a little bit into some of the stuff. Now, there's always going to be legal issues that you need to work out and so forth. But I think there's definitely some things to work with there. And you make a really good point, Mark, about how it wasn't, from what I've heard too, is that there was one kind of operation on the military side, and then with Cyber Command, and then there was sort of the Microsoft actions, which were really big with other private companies, but there was such, I don't think there was enough coordination there at all.
Thanks, Sean. Maybe one last attendee question. Francis, are you able in a place where you could ask your question live?
Yes, I can. Sorry, let me just bring it back up in the chat because it was a little long. I just wanted to ask, how much disclosure and transparency should be required of the government and the private sector? Since, FireEye's public acknowledgement of their breach really sparked the whole response that, got us in this meeting, for example. But, and it will take a long time for the full consequences to be known, but I just want to know how much should the government reveal, whether classified systems were exposed or something like that, without exposing additional vulnerabilities and weaknesses that they didn't have to expose, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I think I'm a journalist, so I'm biased towards transparency and disclosure, but I think that people, again, are going to expect more information about this and kind of accounting of what went wrong and what didn't. And I don't know where that comes from, but that's just sort of a inherent sort of demand that I think you can make as a taxpayer. With the response to the 2016 election being, the U.S. government was criticized for being so slow to come out with it and say who was hit and where and what states by the Russians. And so I think that there's more of a standard towards joint statements, sort of laying out what you can say in public on and classification shouldn't be an excuse. Yesterday we had a pretty fairly detailed statement, you could say, from the FBI, DHS, NSA, et cetera, on the state of play in terms of the investigation. So yeah, I don't think you can hide behind classification. This is too important of a breach to not get regular updates in terms of public statements. Not everyone's going to be satisfied with the level of detail, but I'm sure there'll be a lengthy Senate Intelligence Committee report or some such. It's going to take a long time for the analysis to take place. We only learned. We're still learning things about the 2016 Russian operation, last year. So it could take a while, but I think there's, again, more of a standard towards disclosure than there was 3 or 4 years ago.
And I just want to make one pitch for the importance of disclosure. I wrote about credit card hacking for a long time, and for a very long time, the way it would work is every individual retailer would maintain their own list of bad actors. And a criminal who was good at hacking credit cards would start at Target, and if it didn't work at Target, go to Walmart and go to eBay. And each one had to maintain their own list. And it was only when these companies started to work together and share lists of bad actors that security got better. Because we are all connected now, all of our security relies on each other. And the culture of secrecy around cybersecurity incidents really does hurt all of us. And so, I realize, again, I'm a journalist, I'm biased towards disclosure. Disclosure is embarrassing, but information sharing is the only tool we really have to fight back. And the less we share, the more the bad guys have an advantage.
And I think that point's so incredibly important for also what the public policy response is going to need to be. It has been a priority, both for the Obama administration and the Trump administration to try to encourage cybersecurity threat and vulnerability information sharing. We've gone to great lengths, I believe, to increase transparency around the use of vulnerabilities. So the vulnerability to equities process, the charter for it, which has been made public, that the government is using. But I agree, like this needs to be something we continue working on. We need to continue taking a look at what are the barriers to transparency, and are we really just protecting the information that would cause a lot more harm that if we made transparent, or are for bad reasons, are we keeping a lot of information private instead of communicating it out to people who could protect themselves? I don't know, Sean, do you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. And I was just, you just triggered a thought in my mind about covering the 2020 campaign in terms of cybersecurity, and you would ask the various candidates, when there were many of them on the Democratic side, what you're doing in terms of cybersecurity. What do you do to protect your networks? Who do you have on staff? And unfortunately, some of the responses that you would get are still, well, we can't tell you because that would be, it's a security by obscurity approach that is outdated, but unfortunately still flies, where people say, well, we can't tell you because that would expose us to attackers, which isn't true. You can tell me, have you hired a chief information security officer? And the only campaign that did that I know of was Pete Buttigieg. Hired a very good guy on that. Do you use multi-factor authentication? Do you do this? Because the public has the right to know. And if you say you use it, that does not expose you to more attacks. It's and if anything, a vote of confidence for you. So absolutely, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and people need to be more forthcoming on this kind of thing in terms of what they're doing.
I want to ask one last really quick question, Sean, of you. Once again, to bring this full circle all the way back to when we started the event, if you had one piece of advice for students who are interested in these issues, cybersecurity, technology policy, national security, what would you say to them to focus on while they're at Duke University and studying?
That's a great question. I mean, it's great to see the cyber program continue to gain steam. I'm really glad to see that you have it. I guess it would be to surround yourself with people who have a diversity of opinions on cybersecurity, because as we've talked about in the last hour and a half, there are many takes out there. Many people have a really valuable perspective that you wouldn't think of, whether from a legal background, technical malware analysis, or something else. So it would be to A, do that, but B, also pay close attention to how geopolitics shapes all this, because that's a big thing about what you would presumably be looking at while you're a student at Duke too. Is this doesn't happen in a bubble. The SolarWinds espionage operation it wasn't just anybody that carried it out. It was a motivated adversary with intelligence goals and everything. And some of the most interesting writing that we're able to do is when there's a geopolitical angle. North Korea, fascinating case study, and limited resources, but maximizing them in cyberspace. So I guess it would be generic things like stay inquisitive and talk to people who can shape your perspective in different ways, and have a historical perspective on computer security. People who were doing it before you were born, the student was born. So don't close your mind to ways that your career might open up in terms of cybersecurity. It's really changing a lot. It'll change within the next several years by the time you graduate. And then, like I said up front, don't write yourself off in terms of if you don't necessarily have those hard skills. People like to point, a great example is, Chris Krebs, the leader of CISA, a lawyer by training, not a software engineer, nor does he need to be, or should he be, to run an agency like that. It's leadership skills and policy. So I think learning on the job like that with people where you can I mean, I would have liked to, I could still do it as a journalist, take some time out of my reporting rigors of the daily reporting to brush up on some technical skills. There's ways to that don't require redoing everything in terms of your education, that you can make yourself more attractive to employers with training and with other things that are available free. And the last thing, I know that I said the last thing already, but people in this community, we're to use the word community generally because it still is a community, are really generous with their time in talking to you. I'm really grateful to all the sources who explain things to me that they know in their sleep, but are extremely technical. And I say, okay, how should I explain this to the reader? And they walk you through it. And it's the same way with people entering the field. It's a community. With COVID, it's very difficult because you don't have the luxury of going to these awesome hacking conferences where there's a communal spirit and people are learning from each other and you meet some great people, but that'll start up eventually again. So use all those resources that are out there and pay attention to all the changes that are happening in the industry.
Sean, I love that because that was one of the best pitches I've ever heard for the values of the type of liberal arts education that Duke University specializes in and the interdisciplinary approach that we have between the law school and the public policy school and the engineering school and the computer science department. One thing I would tell all the students who are on there, one of the co-sponsors of this event is our student organization, Duke Cyber. That's a university-wide organization. If you want to get involved, you want to talk to people, there's a mix of folks who are interested in a wide variety of academic subjects who come together at Duke Cyber. Wonderful thing to participate in. And obviously you can reach out to me to get more involved in our overall cyber policy program. We're incredibly fortunate in this country, as John and Bob have both referenced, to have a number of dedicated folks who've done public service to try to improve cybersecurity. Sean was mentioning Chris Krebs. We mentioned Ari Schwartz before. We mentioned Michael Daniel before. We mentioned Kurt Dukes at the NSA. I think we could mention Ann Neuberger, the head of the new cybersecurity directorate at the NSA. We could mention Becky Richards, the civil liberties and privacy officer at the NSA. And this is an incredible thing that we have in the United States, that people who could have incredibly lucrative careers in the private sector see the value of public service. And we should recognize them all for that, because things could be so much worse if these incredible people were not doing that. And I want to impress upon students, that is an incredible thing for you to look to potentially do with your careers. I also want to thank dedicated journalists, Sean, like you and Bob, who have taken on to try to add to transparency and sunlight and inform people about this and allow people to get educated. Thank you for investing the time to come do this type of an event to help participate in that. I'm really grateful to you both for doing this and helping our program, and really grateful to all of you on, once again, a very difficult day, for joining us here for this discussion. I look forward to getting questions and contacts from everybody offline. Thanks and have a great evening.
Thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck.